All right, hi everyone. Okay, so I want to say hello and happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. I'm profoundly grateful for the contributions that you make to my kids and that you make to my life. And I want to thank you for being a good dad and let you know that you don't have to be perfect to be awesome. So Wes asked me to start off today by talking a little bit about the Poor People's Campaign. A few months ago, after our conversations about common good Christians, I was made aware of the Poor People's Campaign and decided that it was an important effort for me to join in whatever small way that I could. And I'm happy to share a little bit about what I know. But I just want to give you all a caveat that I'm not an expert. I'm a participant, and unfortunately, due to life circumstances, I'm not, I haven't been as active as I wish I had been. So I come to you very humbly and just request your indulgence as I try to explain what I think is really a powerful way for us to get involved and to make a difference. So I wanted to, and I apologize, I did not see the whole video that was played, so I apologize if I'm duplicating any information that you may have heard in the video. For some reason, my little phone was kind of cutting in and out. But just very briefly, and first as a bit of a reflection, as I was reading the scripture for today, I wanted to think about the span of time that was covered by the scriptures that we are discussing today, or that we looked at today, because I think the passage of time can do many things to the way in which we experience life and problems and solutions, and it really is something that's hard to keep track of when we look to the Bible for information or answers about how other people have experienced God over time. So my understanding about Deuteronomy is that it was written, possibly 1,000 years ago, over 1,000 years ago, and Psalms was written, about 1,000 years ago. And so, Wes, hopefully, if you have concerns about my accuracy, just pop in a little note at the bottom. But what I find interesting about that is when I think about Exodus and the experience of the Jews in Israel, the Jews in Egypt, for example, sometimes it feels as if the Jews were slaves, and then they were released, and then everybody went to across the desert, made their way to Israel, and then everybody experienced freedom, and everything was great. And then you have a series of empires that come in and out. But it's really hard to keep in mind that a lot of this is happening over hundreds and possibly thousands of years of time. And it's easy to become impatient in the world in which we live, where everything seems to happen so quickly that we demand results now. We criticize organizations because they're not effective enough, because things haven't happened right now. We get upset or frustrated with leaders because they're not perfect right now. There are entire campaigns where we pick apart leaders or members of organizations that are working on these justice and equal rights issues, and we simply just shred them to bits because they're not perfect now. And I just want us to keep in mind that the biblical struggle, as I see it, where God is revealing over and over and over again his frustration with humankind and our inability to get things right, and his desire, his fierce desire for us to experience equality and to experience justice. The way I see that, it's happening over a really long time, and it's kind of an indulgence for us to be frustrated about what we experience day to day, when poor God has to be completely, wringing his hands as a heavenly Father, just in agony over the length of time that it's taking human beings for us to get where God seems to want us to go, which is a place that's fair and loving for everyone. So when I talk about the Poor People's Campaign, It really started in the 60s, and it was an idea and a series of strategies and a group that was brought together initially by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his many, many associates. So we always keep Martin Luther King in mind as some kind of figurehead. But we have to remember that there were thousands and thousands of people that were working for equal rights, that were working for civil rights during the 60s. And so this was a piece of that puzzle. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was an important part of that. And it began in 1968. And so the idea behind this Poor People's Campaign was that there would be a series of strategies that would be put into place. The strategies would include marches. They would include the disruption of city activities. They would include weekly sit-ins. They would include a number of other actions that were designed to disrupt the economy and to disrupt the way that cities were functioning at the time, to allow, to build a movement that would allow the voices of the poor and the voices of people who are disenfranchised to become loud enough to seek policy change. Now, all of these things happened in 1968, and of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was unfortunately assassinated. And so, nevertheless, the folks who were driving this campaign continued in their efforts. And these are, some of the many, many things that we're learning now that I didn't learn when I was in school, was that there were mule trains. They took mule trains and they marched across the country. They tried to get to the Republican National Convention, and they tried to get to the Democratic Convention, where they ended up in Chicago. And they worked constantly to try to ensure that people who were being shut out by the economy as it was at the time would be heard. One of the things that I've learned is that Robert F. Kennedy requested that there be a march of poor people to make poverty and hunger visible in Washington, D.C. And that was one of his specific requests. And if we look at that period of time and the assassinations that occurred during that period of time, I think what we can see is that this idea of economic disruption and struggling for economic justice was profoundly antagonistic to the powers that be, just as they are today. One of the things that I found interesting was that the FBI had a program that was designed to splinter that particular movement. And one of the things that they tried to do was they tried to publicize news articles that would make it look as if the Poor People's Campaign was in a fractious dispute with Quakers. I mean, I don't know why anybody would do that. That seems really unreasonable to me. It's really hard to make Quakers sound antagonistic towards anything, but nevertheless, the FBI made a noble effort. And to some degree, they were successful. And so that movement did disperse, although there was a chapter of the Poor People's Campaign that continued on. So currently, we are dealing with a revitalization of the Poor People's Campaign. And that is really being brought to our attention after a 2018 effort called the Souls of Poor Folk Moral Audit. And I believe I heard the pastor speaking about this, and I apologize. His name just flipped out of my mind, so I apologize. I spent so much time looking at the guy lately. Reverend Barber. Now, Reverend Barber did speak about the Souls of Poor Folk Moral Audit, and I would just really challenge you to think about like sort of that title, because to me, it's like, oh, like, what is this? Souls of poor folk. How are you going to morally audit the souls of poor folk? Like, what does that mean? And I think what that reflects on my part is like some ignorance about Black churches and sort of the language that's used in Black churches, which is uncomfortable, radical, and often it just seems a little bit reflective of an experience that I have so little contact with. I can't quite understand it. But nevertheless, uh, I I'm working on just sitting with it. What does it mean to audit the moral, the moral landscape in which we find ourselves, and how um, Black and brown people and poor people experience that? I have to sit with that, Um, and part of what that moral audit did was that it was a call to a higher ground. Um, it evaluated some of the statistical uh, facts about poverty in America and how poverty is working for people in different segments of the population. And then it went on to really say things that are extremely hard to hear, because as it describes itself, the purpose was to see the predicaments of the most vulnerable. And I have to do work. I have to do work to imagine that I haven't been seeing the predicaments of the most vulnerable. Because often in my day-to-day life, I volunteer at a food pantry, I see people who are poor. Um, I I do various kinds of things in the community that brings things that are important to poor people to my attention. I try to, I have in my mind a list of things that I'm trying to do to see the predicaments of the most vulnerable. But the reality is that this kind of moral audit requires a moral audit of myself. And so I'm forced to see the ways in which I do activities that could allow me to see the predicaments of the most vulnerable. But internally, sometimes I feel so pained or threatened or uncomfortable that I sort of block myself off from experiencing those predicaments empathetically, because it is painful. But the goal of this moral audit was precisely that, to put folks like me, people of beige, in, who are in the middle class and, possibly sort of educated, to put us in that position where we are face to face with the predicaments of the most vulnerable. And the goal is, as they put it, to redeem a democratic process enshrined in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, but to make sure that that redemption occurs within the experience of the individuals who experience life in this country and in the passion of grassroots activists. So I think that's a profound thing in and of itself. Some of us worked very hard. We worked really hard to get through school. We went to college. We got graduate degrees. We did a lot of things that were born of our own experience. Everything that I've done in my life is based on my experience as a child in a family that was very poor. And yet it's so easy through that process of reading philosophies and reading ideas and thinking about people in the context of ideas and thoughts and philosophies and the ideas of people who don't know them very well but are studying them. It's very easy to become disconnected from our own experiences. And if we haven't had those experiences, it's even easier to be disconnected from those experiences. So it's critical, really, that the platform of this organization relies on the voices of people who are living lives that are affected by the things that we say and do. So that emphasis on grassroots activism, I think, is really critical to I think, the success of this program. So the platform that has been derived through conversations with grassroots activists and people on the ground and people who are working very hard to deal with issues of poverty that affect them in their own neighborhoods. It's quite interesting, and I'll share it with you. So part number one, here. Part number one, establish justice and end systemic racism. the right to democracy and equal protection under the law. Simple, right? Part 2, promote the general welfare, the right to welfare and an adequate standard of living. Now, this is a challenging idea for me. You know, I grew up in a family where we got welfare, and welfare and the welfare was an issue in our house. To get welfare, you could not have a father in your house, and so my dad would sometimes disappear for his own reasons, but sometimes he would disappear so that my mom could get welfare and food stamps. We grew up on, commodities, and my mom lived through that process of trying to get the welfare and to explaining why she was poor and why she had so many children. But the way in which she did that was from a very white middle class point of view, which is, I'm not like those other mothers. And often, unfortunately, her point of view was somewhat racist. So she believed that because she was married and had children, that she was morally superior to women who did not get married and had children. And in particular, there was a sort of like separation in her mind between what she considered welfare queens and people who were entitled to welfare as a way of keeping themselves alive and surviving a very short, difficult time. And so the idea that we would be entitled to welfare if we cannot subsist in a modern capitalist economy on our own under our current circumstances is an extraordinary idea to me, and one that I think we really need to sit with. Part 3, ensure domestic tranquility, the right to work with dignity. This is sort of the flip side of that. To have the right to work with dignity means that you have the right to work under conditions that are safe and that do not benefit your employer through the lack of safety. So your harm cannot contribute to your employer's profits. If they get a profit, then they should be making your workplace safer. The right to have wages that allow you to live in a house, to feed yourself, to raise your children, to have health care. That's what the right to work in decent conditions is about. Part 4, securing the blessings of liberty. The right to health and a healthy environment. I think as has been noted many, many times, people of color and people in Appalachia and people who are poor receive the bulk of the distress that results from environmental harm to our environment. And they are the most easily displaced, and they are the ones that we choose to displace. Specific decisions are made to displace them when environmental or climate changes happen. So this is a critical part of the platform. And number 5, provide for the common defense. Reprioritize our resources. This is a concern that's related in the military-industrial complex and the amount of our budget that goes to fund military endeavors here and all around the world. So in addition to the platform, there's a number of principles that they work under which I think are helpful and which help me as I try to think about how to participate in this experience or in this group. Everybody in, nobody out. Everybody is deserving of our nation's abundance. We live in a wealthy, wealthy country. We forget that. I forget it because sometimes I'm really busy making boxes for people who don't have enough food. And I'm just trying to figure out how to make sure they get eggs for the day. We forget that we live in the wealthiest country in the world and that we throw enough away every day to feed everyone who's hungry in this country. And I think as individuals, we become disconnected with how our choices make that possible. 2, when you lift from the bottom, everybody rises. This is in direct conflict with sort of I wouldn't describe it as neoliberal, but with the idea that trickle-down economics, benefiting the wealthy, somehow eventually reaches the poor, because it allows for an increase in capital and more jobs and those kinds of things. The reality is that a gallon of milk costs $3. Sometimes it costs $2. If you don't have $2, you can't buy a gallon of milk. If you only make $100, a gallon of milk is a big deal. If you make $1 billion, a gallon of milk is nothing. And I think it's important to remember that this is what we're talking about, and that's the kind of income disparity that we're discussing. Let's see here. Number 3, prioritize the leadership of the poor, low income, and most impacted. And that's really about nothing about us without us. Those in the front lines of the crisis must also be in the lead in identifying solutions. Number 4, debts that cannot be paid must be relieved. Well, I think everyone who has a student loan kind of understands the logic of this, but it's really difficult, I think, to understand how deep the industry of debt making, debt collecting, and how deep those industries run in our country and in the way in which we view people. Our scripture today talks about, in Deuteronomy talks about the day when folks have their debts canceled. Every 7 years you have your debts canceled. A lot of us have 30-year mortgages. A lot of us have 15-year mortgages. Some people can't afford any mortgage at all. Some people become in debt by going to, these credit companies that will charge you 24% interest to borrow $100 to pay your electric bill. Well, that's usury, but we permit it, encourage it, and allow it in our country. And that kind of debt kills people. It literally kills people. Number 5, we need a moral revolution of values to repair the breach in our land. I think it's hard as a Mennonite to think about that. Or Mennonite Church of the Brethren person. I go to church. I try to follow a lot of, what I think are the things I can manage about the teachings of Jesus, which are really too hard for the average person. But what does it mean to have a moral revolution of values? That sounds really difficult, but it is absolutely true. Because right now, as we all know, we live in a world where morality, as a concept or as an idea, means very little. And whether we're focusing on criticizing the morality of the Bible and saying, well, the morality of the Bible, when it talks about sexuality, doesn't make sense. We're kind of giving ourselves permission to ignore the other parts of it that make deep sense and that are required of us if we are to live a moral life that's based on the values of the Bible. Someone once said, well, in the Bible, they never talk about abortion. But I believe that if you look at the Bible, and you'll see that God talks about usury hundreds of times. So we want to really grapple. It's going to require that we grapple with the morality of what we do every day. And that, I think, is a hard ask, but I think it's a worthy ask. So the Poor People's Campaign addresses multiple issues, and I think it's really, really important to accept the fact that these issues are overwhelming, and to understand what it means for an issue to be overwhelming. Environmental harm, the war economy, giving up our reliance on the military-industrial complex to provide the illusion of security, mass incarceration, police brutality, debt, and economic inequality. These are not small problems, but the Poor People's Campaign advocates for addressing these issues in a broad way, because they believe that without addressing each piece, we cannot address the whole, and that we will not make the systemic change that we need to make in order to make our country, our state, our community a more equitable and a more just place. So I'm going to make an ask, and I'm going to ask that you join, but no pressure, right? Because I know each one of you, and I know that each one of you is dedicated in your own way to making this world a better and more just place. This is just one way to help. So I'm going to ask that you join and support the Poor People's Campaign. And then there's lots of ways to do that, but I'd like to address the why. Why the specific group? Because we are, for the, really, we've got a couple of folks of beige in there, but we're primarily white and middle class or students. So why should we focus on the possibility of joining a group that is about solidarity with folks that we may not see every day, when we're so busy trying in other ways to make the world a better place, or to care for our families, or to work with our children. So I would like to encourage us to think about the possibility that this specific movement opens a door for people who are privileged to participate in God's work that's revealed in Scripture, to care for the poor, to seek justice for the oppressed, to free the enslaved, and to make a sacred place in our society and in the way we run our government, and the way we carry out our police actions, to make a sacred place for life and for human life and for all of life that we believe that God has played a role in creating, or that we believe is God reflected in our existence. So we've talked a little bit about our scriptures today, about how how in Deuteronomy, the idea is that debt and the forgiveness of debt is a critical part of dealing with poverty. It specifically says that we do not need to believe that poverty is an inherent part of God's plan. We don't have to believe that this is the way God designed the world. To the contrary, if we follow the rules that are given to us, God's dream is that no one will be poor. And if you look at that chunk of Deuteronomy, not just the few verses that we looked at today, but chapter 12, chapter 13, chapter 14, chapter 15, there are, of course, some things that are culturally objectionable, things that we might find distressing. But what I find to be most compelling is that the focus of those requirements is about feeding the poor. And even the sacrifices that are made to God, God sets out, how sacrifices are to be made, but the sacrifice and the purpose of the sacrifice is not to give away 1/10 of your income so that someone else can eat. It's so that you eat what's sacrificed to God in a meaningful, reverent way. And that we eschew other idols, and that we tear down the altars that have been built to other gods, because what those gods ask in their worship is offensive to God, including child sacrifice. I think when we think about our culture and the way we treat other people and how we can live in the world, if we look at the places where we sacrifice our children, we sometimes choose, and our children sometimes choose, to sacrifice themselves to the military-industrial complex. Is that a place of idol worship for us? Participating in this campaign is a way for us to really address these concerns and to have an end to search our own hearts in a way that God has been asking us to all along. So, and then hundreds of years later, the psalmist writes that the godly have disappeared, that we do not have, that the people we relied on don't exist anymore. And the way we can tell that is because of the oppression of the weak and the groans of the needy. Participating in this process allows us to hear the voices of the weak and the groans of the needy. And it's painful. It's excruciating. It's a very physically and emotionally hard thing to do. But if we don't listen, if we don't pay attention, then we cannot count ourselves among the godly. We cannot tell that the godly exist anymore because there's no one to hear them. This program and this crusade really allows us an in to hear what we need to hear to be the people of righteousness that God asks us to be. It really allows us to learn and to live a fuller life from the position of people who are inherently privileged. We won't understand the world. We will not understand ourselves. We won't understand the poor. We won't understand how poor we are unless we can understand the sufferings of other people in our world. Number 3, I think it's important for us to participate because we can. As people with privilege, we can be the gatekeepers. And a gatekeeper is somebody who opens the door. You know, we can choose to be gatekeepers who close the door, who say, that's not our problem, that's not the issue that we need to deal with right now. Or we can, bridge the gap between our own experience and the experiences of people who are suffering because we have the power, the education, the privilege, and the time to do it. And then number 4 is that we all have underlying experiences that are related to these problems and challenges, whether it's our own experiences as people who are privileged with, in regards to race, with the way we've experienced racism in our society and in our culture, or suffered from watching other people experience racism, whether we are suffering because people in our own family have suffered from the experiences of racism and poverty, whether we ourselves have experienced experiences that were harmful or dangerous because of racism or poverty. We have, every single person has trauma related to these issues. And we experience uncomfortable feelings and helplessness. And this is a way for us to get access to the information and the folks and the humanity that we need to begin to recover from our trauma by taking the actions we need to take. So I wanted to talk really briefly about my family and about, some of on the micro level, how I'm trying to work my way through some of these issues. As I mentioned in children's time, this is my dad, David. And my experiences with the Black Lives Matter movement and some of these things that are happening now are really making me uncomfortable because it forces me to consider the life of my father in a different way, from a different perspective. As many of you know, I had a very confusing upbringing, and it was really quite challenging. We were very poor. My mother married my dad. My mother was from a middle-class farming family in Nebraska, and she married my dad. This is my dad, David. He was 17 when she met him, and she was, I think, 21. And she was a lovely little white missionary in Omaha in the early 70s. And what you may not know about Omaha in the early 70s was that there was a lot of racial injustice and difficulty that was happening during that period of time. So she met him in the context of, meetings that were happening in churches about racial equality. And here's a picture of my dad's family. This is my dad's mom, Aurora. These are his sisters, and these are my cousins. So my dad had a white father. His mother was from Michoacan, Mexico, and my cousins and aunts, his sisters were half Black and half Mexican. So he grew up in a Black family during the early 70s and 60s. And so for him, the experience of racism, as he expressed it to me when I was a very, very young child, was extremely toxic and painful and excruciating for him to bear. I'm convinced to this day that his experiences with racism, including being abandoned by his own father when he was an infant, resulted in a lot of his reactive attachment disorder and the other mental illnesses that really plagued him throughout his whole life, and ultimately led to his death. So my white missionary mom met my dad, and he was a really wonderful project. And that project did not go so well in the context of our lives or in our childhood. And it was not the fantasy, the religious fantasy that she was sort of promised, you know, that if you marry some nice guy, you can convert him and get him to do the things that you want him to do, and you can have exactly what you wanted all along, which is sort of a white middle class life. Because of my dad's experiences with racism and poverty, he pulled my mother into his world rather than her being successful in pulling him into hers. And so our family experienced a lot of really challenging poverty, but also the racism that had affected him in his early life really percolated into our family in extremely toxic ways. So in our family, we all look very different. Everyone's a different color. Everyone's kind of just various shades of beige. I have a brother who looks like an Arab sheikh, and I have my other brother, and I don't know where he came from, but he looks exactly like my mom. And unfortunately, the racism that my dad experienced was very toxic. And so trying to work through that as a young person, when I was being really raised in the end by white guys who played the accordion, and a white family that was really trying to live out their idea of a sort of middle class white educational and economic success, was quite confusing. So this process of having to live with these experiences, and then trying to understand my dad, who passed away several years ago, has been a painful one. But it's an important motivation for me to try to work on these issues, to try to do my part, and to try to get through the emotional discomfort that I'm experiencing. And what I would like to encourage us all to do is to remember a few things. You know, discomfort is not actually pain, it's discomfort. And if we're in a privileged group, if we have access to food, water, a room to lay our children to sleep, that's not pain and it's not suffering. What we're being asked to do is to go beyond our discomfort to relieve the suffering of other people. And I think the discomfort, in terms of our pain or our time or our, you know, it's sort of the logistics, the discomfort, these are things that we can bear in our efforts to make the world a more equitable place. And I'd finally like to say that we have wonderful examples. We have wonderful examples of people who are working on racial equality issues, who are working on international justice issues, who are working on the day-to-day health issues of folks in Appalachia. We are surrounded, and we are those people who are working so hard to raise those we love and care about in our community in the best way we can, because it lifts us all. We are those people. And so I like to think that the Poor People's Campaign is a call to us directly, because we're the perfect people for this specific movement. And whether we can join this group or not join or decide that it's just not the right thing for us to do right now, I think we can support each other. We can love each other. We can continue to do what we always do and what we do every day. I'd like to say in particular, that we see this with the parents in our congregation. We have parents who are raising kids who are having a hard time. We have parents who are raising kids who have gone through really tremendous challenges in their lives and as parents. And still, we can see the loving, caring hand of God in the parents in our community and in our congregations, in the way they reach out to our children, in the way that we reach out to other children. And I believe that we have what we need to really offer the loving care that our community needs right now. So thank you. Amen. That's it. Y'all have a great day. Bye.